Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Marxist Voice. You're with me, Adam Booth, the host for tonight, the editor of Socialist Appeal, website socialist.net. And if you're not already following socialist.net on our various channels, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, head over now and give us a like and subscribe. And of course, subscribe to the podcast, Marxist Voice, on Spotify, on iTunes, any major podcast provider, so you can get more regular updates with Marxist ideas, analysis, and theory, history, all sorts, going straight into your podcast provider and platform. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the easing of the lockdown. Last night, obviously, we had Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, giving a speech to the nation about the plans for the ending of the lockdown and what things might start to look like in the coming weeks and months. But I think it's fair to say that most people were probably a little bit confused by Boris's speech and aren't quite sure what actually does lie in store for Britain, for ordinary people. So tonight we're going to be discussing what exactly was the take-home message of Boris's announcements last night, and what this tells us about the political situation in Britain and beyond. Now, joining us for this discussion tonight is Ben Curry, the one of the editors of Socialist Appeal on the editorial board, and I'm just going to bring in Ben now. You all right, Ben?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, Adam. You all right?
Yeah, well, very well. How are you doing in isolation?
Yeah, keeping going. I think best as can be expected.
Good to hear. Well, yeah, you've been obviously following the news, as I'm sure we all have on this question. And as I said to the viewers a second ago, like the rest of us, I'm sure there's a lot of confusion for yourself and everyone over exactly what on earth was Boris actually saying. Amidst all his waffling and his usual kind of gesticulations, what exactly was the take-home message from last night's announcement?
Yeah, I think that first of all, like you say, I think most people came away from last night's announcement more confused than when they went into it. To be honest, I think that you always expect this with Boris Johnson, a certain amount of bluff and bluster. But beyond that, it was a little bit difficult to get what the message was. They'd scrapped their main slogan, which was "Stay home and save lives." This has obviously been the headline-grabbing thing with the newspapers today. Although it should be said that this is only in England, in the devolved governments, they're actually keeping this slogan rather than adopt the government's far more confused slogan, which is "Stay alert, control the virus." I think we're all left scratching our heads as to exactly what that means. And I think, though, when you just strip away the bluff and the bluster that you come to expect with Boris, I think that the main message is that they're trying to nudge people back to work. I think there was clearly a lot of thought had gone into this messaging. They'd even changed the border around it from a red and yellow sort of clear hazard sign to a more green and yellow, a bit ambiguous. Does it mean hazard? Does it mean it's safe to go back to work? So I think that there's a certain amount of deliberate ambiguity, because they are trying to reopen the economy. They are trying to basically force workers back into work, and they're coming under the pressure of big business, of course. They're coming under the pressure of the billionaires. And in particular, in construction and manufacturing, they've been clamoring to open up the lockdown for a long time. And that's what they're going to do, particularly in these two sectors. They're going to open up the lockdown from Wednesday, although Boris actually said Monday, and there was a bit of confusion even amongst the government about exactly what day they were opening up the lockdown. And workers are basically going to be thrown into the meat grinder to restore the profits of big business. Clearly, a lot of the backbench Tories themselves are also very worried about the furlough scheme, how much that's going to cost.
And it said, he said in his announcements, Boris, that workers should go back, particularly as he said in construction and manufacturing, but they should avoid public transport. So what the hell are people supposed to do? Walk all the way to work? And what kind of conditions can they expect when they get there as well? I mean, this comes on the back of some kind of draft guidelines for workplaces that the government released last week, which included blank pages, if I'm not incorrect. So, what exactly is happening here? What workers going to expect?
Well, yeah, I mean, like you say, they said there's a lot of conditionals in the whole speech from last night. Where possible, work from home. So I'm sure there's a lot of workers in the manufacturing and construction industry wondering about how they're going to get their production lines and their cement mixers into their front living room. Obviously, maybe some of the managers will be able to work from home, and probably they've been working from home since before the lockdown began. But for the frontline workers, it's obviously not going to be possible. They're going to be thrown into the firing line to restore the profits for the bosses. And there's a clear class division over who suffers the most in this situation. It's the poorest who have been suffering the most, who have been suffering the highest mortality rates. I mean, you've already seen that, as I say, a lot of managers were already working from home since before the lockdown began. And the unskilled workers, laborers, for example, are 3 to 4 times more likely to die as a result of COVID-19 than workers in management or professional workers. So it's than professionals. So already it's quite clear that it's the poorest who are going to pay. Likewise, these if you can, it would be very good if you could take the car, or if you could walk, or if you could cycle. If you've got several miles to go and you rely upon public transport, however, like the poorest workers will be, then of course you're told to still go ahead and go to work. And like you mentioned, as you mentioned, the the government issued a set of draft guidelines last week, it's still draft guidelines. There are no set in stone guidelines actually for what employers should do now that they are returning to work, and that's because these guidelines met with stiff resistance from the trade unions. The government needed the trade unions really to help get workers back into work, because of course workers don't trust the bosses. They've seen that workers in essential industries have been suffering from a lack of PPE, a lack of social distancing, and all of these sort of things. And they know that these penny pinching bosses are going to do the same for non-essential workers when they return to work. So, but the trade unions themselves are coming under a huge amount of pressure. And like you say, this guidelines really, I mean, in the words of Frances O'Grady, she said basically the government were crossing their fingers and hope that bosses act responsibly, hope that bosses introduce social distancing measures, hope that bosses introduce PPE and these sort of things. Of course, there's no incentive for the bosses to do that. It'll only cost them more when they're already running up against very tight margins. They've lost a huge amount, and they'll be eager to get that profit back at the expense of the workers who are now being thrown into the meat grinder.
And talking of meat grinders, last week, I think it was, or maybe the week before, Greggs announced that they were going to reopen to serve up that essential service of the sausage and bean melt. And that was obviously in response to the fact that other businesses were also kind of just deciding without any government no green light, as we've been seen last night. You had KFC and other competitors of Greggs obviously opening before that. So it seems like a lot of this is happening basically. It's a fait accompli that's been presented to the government effectively. The bosses are saying we're going to open unilaterally, and you've just got to kind of give the seal of approval to something that's already happening. And you mentioned also kind of the competition between the bosses internationally, as well as obviously a big driving force with other countries also coming out of lockdown. So, can you explain a little bit more what exactly is driving all of this desperate kind of race to open up as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think, like you say, if there was a lot of confusion about exactly what the message was, I think certainly the newspapers today have summed it up as trying to nudge people back to work, basically. In other words, it's giving the green light to the bosses, get your workers back to work. And we've heard a number of statements, I think, from which really shows that the Tory ministers, these Tory MPs, they're like the Bourbons in the 18th century. Their attitude is that workers are a bit. I think it was Rishi Sunak who said that we're addicted to the furlough money, as if workers are addicted to eating and drinking and having a roof over their heads. And there was some other Tory MP who said that some workers are a little bit too comfortable with the whole furlough situation and the lockdown. And they're reflecting the pressure of big business who are desperate to open up. There is this pressure within the Tory party. They are of course the party of big business. But at the same time, there is another wing in the Tory party, which sees that if they do open up prematurely and it cause an inevitable second wave of the virus, this is going to have a massive political backlash for the party. And this is going to destabilize the government at a certain stage. There is going to be a payback. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And this has caused splits to open up in the government. And this has led to a bit of this is the whole reason this message is confused is because Boris is clearly trying to rest between these two camps, right? He's coming under these conflicting pressures, politically stabilizing his government, whereas also serving the interests of big business, who are his ultimate backers. But like you say, I mean, it's not just the pressure from the British business, I think. There's the international scenario, as you mentioned. I mean, we've got to look at this as, this is really, there is a mad situation where capitalism on a world scale has obviously gone into this deep crisis. And now we have a situation where some countries are starting to come out of the lockdown. Lots of countries went into lockdown at very different times, right? Now, of course, the first ones to go into lockdown were China. And when China went into lockdown, it's been in lockdown for 3 months, and then last month it came out of lockdown. There was very little advantage, really, from the point of view of Chinese capitalism to be the first ones out of lockdown, because the rest of their world markets were completely closed, basically. Although I read an interesting article, I think it was in the Financial Times, basically saying that China is now retooling its factories desperately to try and get an advantage over other capitalist nations in terms of medical supplies. That's one area of the market they can outcompete their competitors, as they're the first to come out of lockdown. But generally, there's been no advantage. There is, however, a stark disadvantage to be the last nation to come out of lockdown. If all of the other nations start to come out of lockdown, you're going to face a situation where if you're the last one to come out of lockdown, then other gangs of capitalists basically are going to grab your markets. And that's the pressure that the British capitalism are facing. And that's the real panic that is grasping the minds of big business in Britain. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that, yes, you've seen the lockdown, different countries went into lockdown at different times, but they're all coming out in a very short period of time. Austria came out of lockdown on the 1st of May. In Italy, factories, building sites and offices opened on the 4th of May. And today, it's not just Britain that's coming out of lockdown, but it's also being eased in Belgium, in France, and in a week's time, Ireland is planning to ease restrictions, its lockdown restrictions. So it's no coincidence that these countries are coming out of lockdown when there's no evidence that the virus has actually been controlled. I mean, last week, each day you were seeing about 5,000 to 6,000 new cases being diagnosed. And we know, of course, the low level of testing that the government is doing. So it's actually far higher than that. And about 500 to 600 people dying each day last week. So I think that there's no evidence that the thing is under control. They're entirely being driven by the economic necessity of big business to fill up their order books and start making a profit again. And actually,
you said that basically this is ultimately, you've got these two kind of conflicting pressures on the government, which seem to me like class pressures. Basically, you've got the pressure of big business who wants to make profits, and then obviously you've got the pressure of ordinary people, of the working class, you know, which obviously does not want to put their lives on the line for those profits. And these are the pressures that are being reflected in, you know, on Boris trying to do this balancing act. And you mentioned that this actually led to splits in the government itself. How was that reflected around this announcement? You know, was everyone on board with Boris's announcement, or were there, you know, the usual Tory backstabbings going on behind the scenes?
Well, I think we know that you know, the Tory party is a real den of thieves, and there's always backstabbing and looking for the chance to get one over on each other. But of course, like you say, there are already deep splits in the Tory party, and there have been for a while. I think particularly over this question of when are they going to ease the lockdown. And yeah, ultimately, of course, it does reflect different class pressures. Big business wants to begin easing the lockdown, but of course, it's not the CEOs and it's not the capitalists who are going to be risking their lives going back to work. It's ordinary working class people. Of course, the Tories, no wing of the Tory party gives a rat's about ordinary working class people. I think that's quite clear. But they do want to stay in power, and to do that, of course, they know that there is a reckoning coming, basically. And they can't say to people, it is safe to go out to work. So they have to use this sort of non-slogan of stay alert, whatever that means, as if the virus is just going to sneak up on you. Like it's obviously, you know, that's a lot of nonsense. But I think that it's basically trying to put the onus on individuals, that it is the individual's responsibility to keep the virus down, and therefore if we don't keep the virus down, it's because people are being irresponsible, going for picnics, this sort of thing. But yeah, I think, like you say, there are competing pressures on the Tory party, and in fact, the Tory party was already split before coronavirus emerged. The question of Brexit exposed this. The ruling class has been split going back a number of years now, which reflects the deep crisis of British capitalism. But yeah, it's now reaching crisis proportions, and this was reflected actually in the way this whole easing of the lockdown thing has gone through. Actually, they had their meeting to decide the course of action and to decide Sunday night's national address by Boris Johnson. They had a meeting of the cabinet earlier on Sunday, but it turned out that Boris Johnson had basically already recorded the national address on Saturday. So he was basically presenting his own cabinet with a fait accompli. Because, of course, this was the only way to sort of smooth over the kind of divisions that are taking place, rather than have a fractious debate, tell them what's going to happen. And I think that, before the meeting, there was an interesting article in The Guardian saying that none of these ministers turned up prepared. They didn't know what Boris's plan was. And the reason was because he didn't issue them with documents, because he doesn't trust any of these people, because there's constant briefings and counter briefings to the press. So this is the kind of like atmosphere that exists within the Tory government at the moment, complete distrust. And apparently at the start of the meeting, how people know about what went on in this meeting, I don't know. Clearly, all these briefings and, it's as leaky as a sieve. But apparently at the start of the meeting, Boris Johnson had to make a personal apology to Matt Hancock for the constant backstabbing and the negative reports in the right-wing media on Sunday's press. Because clearly Matt Hancock is being briefed against because he's being prepared as a scapegoat for the backlash which is going to face this government. So it's a crisis-ridden government. It's a government which really, if there was an opposition which was worth its salt, could be fighting to bring down this government. Actually, it's completely exposed in the eyes of millions of people. Everyone knows that this stay alert strategy is the old herd immunity strategy, repackaged for the post lockdown period.
Well, and you mentioned the question of the opposition there, and I think a lot of viewers, particularly Labour members, will be asking themselves what opposition, because it does seem to me like you talk about this crisis in the government, this splits in the Tory party, but at the same time you've got Keir Starmer calling for national unity, which seems like a bit of a joke, when the government itself is split, to be calling for national unity. What kind of unity is Starmer imagining there? So how have Starmer and Labour responded, or if at all, on this question?
I mean, to be honest, the Keir Starmer in some ways reminds me of the bad old days of Tony Blair, where you'd hear these same old repeated slogans over and over again, and you notice every single speech he gives, it's got the same words, forensic opposition to the Tory party, national consensus, keeps banging on about this thing, national consensus. Well, the Socialist campaign group of MPs had a good description, basically, of what Boris Johnson's national address last night represented. They described it as a thinly veiled declaration of class war. That's the reality of the situation. And here we have this man, the leader of the opposition, basically groveling on all fours before the government. He's making the meekest and mildest criticisms, and where his criticisms are landing, it's actually backing up this big business call to end the lockdown. For the past few months, he hasn't been talking about the lack of PPE, the lack of social distancing, the lack of testing that's not been going on. I mean, just in the past day, we've seen, I think they hit their target of 100,000 tests at the end of April, on the basis of basically mailing an extra 40,000 of these swabs that they had no capacity to actually send them back to the labs. And then yesterday, news has come out that because they don't have this capacity to actually do this 100,000 tests, they had to send a chartered flight over to the United States to get them tested in American labs, basically. So it's all bluff and bluster, and it's an easy target if there is an opposition willing to actually be an actual opposition. And yet we have this guy like Keir Starmer. Last week, when the government comes out with a bunch of guidelines for a big business, what they're supposed to do to protect their workers, and he describes it as thin and vague. Okay, there's a little bit of it certainly was thin and vague. There's no doubt about it. But then he was quick to reassure the Tories. I'm not setting up a rival camp here, were his exact words. This constant presenting himself as, the need for national unity in this period of crisis. He's really acting to. I think he's consciously trying to demoralise the rank and file, actually, of the Labour Party, and I think he's obviously trying to present himself as a respectable representative of big business, a potential second 11 for big business, were Boris Johnson to be removed and the question of a national unity government to present itself. So all of this stuff about national consensus is not national. There can be no question of it. One of two things will now happen with this lockdown. Either workers will be forced back to work and thousands of people will die as a result, or the workers' movement will bring production to a standstill and will enforce its will upon the bosses. One side has to win over the other. It is a class war, as the Socialist Campaign Group said, and we need, of course, a workers' leadership which is prepared to actually fight fire with fire, which is actually prepared to take the measures which are necessary to stop the spread of this virus in the face of a government which only cares about profits.
And it seems that Starmer, as you say, is actively basically offering his services to the establishment, presumably because he is part of the establishment. Sir Keir Starmer, this former barrister, and I see also recently, Labour members rightly are infuriated, incredibly angry at the fact that Labour's now changed its position also to say that it's no longer in favour of cancellation of rents, but that basically people will just have a little bit longer to pay back arrears of rents that they can't pay because of loss of jobs, loss of income. So you can see across the board Starmer making concession after concession to the landlords, to big business, to the imperialists as well in relation to Kashmir. So and obviously he's in return getting this praise, endless gushing praise from the Financial Times, from the Sunday Times, calling him the forensic kind of examiner, the credible opposition, and it's real nauseating stuff all around. But I guess the question then comes, what are the unions doing about this? Because obviously the unions are affiliated to the Labour Party, and more importantly, what are they doing on the shop floor? What are they doing to organise workers in the face of this kind of bullish behaviour by the bosses and by the Tory government? Are they organising at all to resist this kind of green light that's being given to the bosses to put workers' lives on the line? You mentioned some kind of letter to the Observer and a few other kind of vague things here and there, but can you explain a little bit more? What is the attitude of Francis O'Grady, the TUC, Unite, Len McCluskey, these kind of figures been in recent weeks?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think first of all the trade union leaders come under the more direct pressure of the rank and file of the labour movement, of working class people, and they're anticipating a massive backlash. They're anticipating a fight over this question of forcing workers back into unsafe working conditions, and so they have been forced into a position of more of a position of opposition, really. As you say, there was a letter in the Guardian by Francis O'Grady last week talking about the government's guidelines, where she referred to it as the government basically crossing their fingers and hoping that the employers will basically look after the interests of the workers, which was correct. But in that, and it should be said, most recently, the unions have issued a joint letter in the Observer, as you mentioned, with Francis O'Grady from the TUC and the General Secretaries of Unite, USDOR, GMB, and Unison. So the biggest four trade unions in Britain. And they issued this letter, and it must be said that in this letter, it said nothing, to be honest, about whether they were in favour of the lockdown or not. Implicitly, the trade unions are in favour of ending the lockdown, as Boris Johnson is. But what they did, they were forced, nevertheless, into a certain opposition, saying that work shouldn't proceed if it can't be done safely, which is of course correct, and it reflects the pressure that is coming from below. The natural tendency of these trade union leaders is towards national unity and compromise, just like Keir Starmer and the right-wing Labour Party leaders. And in fact, it should be said that whilst the trade union leaders are being forced into greater opposition to the government than Keir Starmer, that many of these trade union leaders actually backed Keir Starmer when it came to the Labour leadership contest earlier on in the year. I think Unison and USDOR in particular backed Keir Starmer, and GMB backed another right-winger. Only Unite actually backed a left-winger who would carry on Corbyn's programme. So we are partly in this situation because of the right-wing trade union leaders and their tendency towards national unity and compromise. Anyway, so they have
and also
been.
not to mention the fact that also a lot of the heads of these unions were involved in some way or another in the scandalous allegations in the Labour leaked report surrounding active sabotage of Labour's electoral chances in 2017. So yeah, it seems like a real rot at the top of the Labour movement there.
No, absolutely. I mean, it'll come as no surprise to left-wing Labour activists that the trade union leadership have blocked the shift to the left in the Corbyn years, and a party conference, and of course, yes, like you say, the GMB union, which represents the bureaucrats in the Labour Party head office, came out with an outrageous defence of these bureaucrats who'd been implicated in the Labour leaks. So, of course, the trade unions do not have their hands clean, which makes it all the more remarkable, I think, that unions like the GMB are coming under huge pressure and are forced to threaten industrial action to stop workers being sent back into work. You have they've even citing a legal basis for calling wildcat strike action, basically. The GMB and I think the TSSA and a number of other unions have cited the fact that the 1996 Employment Rights Act, Section 44, I think it is, gives workers the right to walk off site if there is an imminent threat to their health and safety, which clearly the coronavirus presents that threat. So the fact that they have been forced to threaten this shows that they're coming under enormous pressure themselves from the rank and file, or that they anticipate an enormous pressure from the rank and file. And so this pressure has to be kept up on the trade union leaders to actually put this threat to bring production to a halt into action rather than simply into words, and to go beyond that and say that actually the threat to our lives is going to continue as long as this Tory government continues. Therefore, we need to bring it down. That presents a bit of a quandary when you've got such a timid and mild opposition in the form of the Labour Party. But the trade union delegates on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, along with the lefts, would constitute a majority. They could turn the course of the Labour Party if they wanted to. So we have to call upon, trade unionists should be putting the pressure on their leaders in this period. The kind of things that they're actually demanding the government do are things like create some enforceable guidelines for employers, carry out sanctions against employers, carry out more, the health and safety executives should carry out more inspections against employers, and that the employers themselves should have to publish risk assessments, which I think that's all very well and good, but the point is you're calling upon a government for the rich to enforce this lockdown in the interests of the easing of the lockdown in the interests of the workers, to carry it out in such a way. Clearly, the bosses are not going to do that. And in fact, Francis O'Grady, in that last week's Guardian article, talked about the fact that over the past number of years, there has been a 70% fall in the number of HSE inspections and an 80% fall in the number of successful prosecutions against employers. So you can't count upon the government to do this for workers. They have to rest upon their own strength. And fundamentally, it's workers themselves who know what PPE they need, what social distancing they need. It's not going to be the employers carrying out these public risk, these health and safety risk assessments. It should be the workers themselves carrying out the risk assessments and fighting, and the unions fighting for workers' power, basically, in the factories, in the workplaces, on the construction sites, so the workers can enforce the necessary measures which are needed to protect workers' lives and to protect the public's lives.
So what kind of demands then, leading on from that, do you think the whole of the labour movement should be fighting for in terms of in the workplace, but also more broadly in order to make sure that it is workers whose lives are put first, and to make sure that the bosses pay?
Well, I think that the first thing is, as I mentioned, directly flown on from what I was saying, this question, I think the trade unions and the trade union leadership need to be raising the question, essentially, not simply of greater laws and regulation and resting upon the state and the courts to enforce the interests of workers. They will never enforce the interests of workers. I mean, part of the problem of the whole Brexit debate was the fact that the labour movement, in many respects, the leadership of the labour movement at least, took a pro-EU position because they were dependent upon EU courts basically defending the interests of workers against British bosses. We can't rest upon that. We can't rest upon British courts defending workers against the bosses. It can only be on the basis of workers' control. Workers themselves know what is possible and what is feasible in terms of reorganizing workplaces in the to defend workers' health and safety. Workers themselves know who can and cannot afford to basically be involved in production safely, who should be allowed to go home because of health risks to themselves or their families. So I think that we should be fighting for complete workers' control of workplaces, including staffing in particular. But I think it goes. We have to go beyond that. I think we have to look at the fact that this crisis, although it is, no one could predict the outbreak of coronavirus. This particular virus, of course, is a natural phenomenon in some ways, but of course it is aggravated by the capitalist system, and we see this on a whole number of in a whole number of ways. Profiteering of the capitalists is forcing this lockdown to happen prematurely. It is also workers themselves who are going to be forced to pay. Part of the reason that the lockdown is being eased, of course, is because of the huge amounts of furlough money that are having to be spent on keeping workers on the payroll of companies. Now, of course, with this, with some of these workplaces starting to reopen, a lot of workers will lose their jobs. So it is workers who are going to pay the economic consequences also. And there is going to be a long-term overhang as a result of this crisis. I'll give you an example. Warren Buffett, who's one of the richest men in America, or at least he was. I don't know if he is now, because he had a lot of stakes in the airline industry, which has lost a lot of value over the past period. And he says the problem is, even if we open up the economy, there are we start flying to destinations again. There will still be 20 to 30% too many planes, basically. In other words, there'll be an excess of planes. There'll be an excess of everything that we need, and this will drive down profits because of this crisis of overproduction, which the system is suffering from, essentially. So the lack of national coordination, the competition between national gangs of capitalists, and this massive overproduction is going to cause ordinary working class people to be forced to foot the bill at the end of the day on the basis of capitalism, and it is aggravating this crisis. On the basis of socialism, there would not have been a coronavirus crisis. It would have been simple to basically shut down economies and reorganize who is deployed where from the point of view of what is socially necessary. There would have been no question of unemployment, no question of workers, even key workers who are at risk, having to put themselves at risk. There would have been a rational plan to the response of coronavirus, and it would have been carried out on an international basis. Part of the reason I think that Europe is particularly affected is because you have different countries pulling in different directions with regard to their policies. Some of them, like Sweden, thinking that if they don't apply a lockdown whatsoever, they will evade the economic consequences and get one over on their competitors. So I think on the basis of it is capitalism which is aggravated and turns this crisis into a catastrophe for humanity. So I think we have to say that beyond this, there needs to be a socialist response. We need to fight for a socialist plan of production in Britain and on a world scale. And that means, of course, getting active, joining an organization which is fighting for that. That's at the end of the day, that's what our organization is, the International Marxist Tendency and Socialist Appeal in Britain. And we should join together and fight to turn the labor movement into fighting organizations and clear out the bureaucracy which is holding back the fight for these sort of demands.
Thank you, Ben. I think that's an excellent place to end it for tonight. Thanks to everyone at home for joining us. Thanks, Ben. Hopefully see you soon again on the show, and if not in real life when the lockdown is lifted further. All right, stay safe and healthy. See you soon. Thanks to everyone again for tuning in at home. If you're not already following us, as I said, on Facebook, YouTube, and so forth, then like us, subscribe us, get the podcast downloaded regularly by subscribing to Marxist Voice. And as Ben said at the end there, most importantly, get involved in the fight for socialism and join the Marxists in the labour movement, Socialist Appeal, to help clear out the bureaucracy, clear out the Blairites, get a socialist Labour Party that's going to be a real opposition to drive out this Tory government. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
We're living through a decisive turning point in history. Tens of thousands of people are dying. The world economy is in freefall. This is the barbarism of the capitalist system. It can't be patched up. It must be replaced. We have the resources to meet everyone's needs and the planet's. A rational, planned, socialist economy is possible. A society based on need, not profit. But we have to fight for it. We need to get educated in revolutionary theory and history. We need to spread our ideas, and we need to organise ourselves. So join Socialist Appeal, the Marxist and the labour and student movement. Join our study groups, spread our online material, and start getting organised with us. We're faced with an historic challenge and an historic opportunity. Seize this moment. Change the world.